Alright, I hope you all aren't sick of hearing me talk about Stephen King yet, because even in this case, we're not quite done with that yet. So, this was obviously one that we talked about forever ago, and then just kind of never got around to it, especially since I kind of felt like I already had, because one of these movies in particular is a movie that I reference, I feel like, constantly in other reviews, especially reviews of action movies. So, yeah, but now we're going to talk about it at length. But we're also going to throw The Running Man into the mix, which, as I said, kind of goes into the Stephen King thing I've been doing for the past couple of months, except for the fact that it's one of the books he did under Richard Bachman, which is really interesting because, to my understanding, if I'm not mistaken, this was a case of the filmmakers didn't realize who Richard Bachman was at the time, and like all the way through production didn't until after the fact. And despite that, though, obviously it's a huge deviation from the book, more or less outside of the initial setup, and even that they took some clear liberties with. So I think we'll actually start talking about The Running Man, and then we'll work our way into Gamer and see where we end up. But yeah, so the director is the guy that played Starsky on Starsky and Hutch, and he would go on, to have a real thriving directorial career. Like, he directed Kazam a decade or so later, but apart from that, it is to my understanding that Schwarzenegger was not happy with the job that he did, and it didn't quite work out the way that he had initially envisioned it, because the interesting thing when you look at The Running Man is when we talked about, I sat right here at this very table in this very chair and talked about Last Action Hero not that long ago. And whenever Last Action Hero comes up now, thankfully, people are addressing more about how it was so ahead of its time and what it was doing in regards to the satire and Schwarzenegger being self-referential and all that. And it was actually, it's kind of the movie that people really go to talk about that, but it's interesting that, like, 6 years prior, with The Running Man, he was already doing that sort of thing, pretty much. Only instead of, not necessarily just, making fun of himself or self-referencing himself, but this was also doing the whole satire on reality TV and audiences, that are bloodthirsty and stuff like that. Stuff that's pretty, like I said, not exactly a hot take today, but when you think about the fact that it's in the guise of a regular Schwarzenegger movie, and like Last Action Hero, kind of didn't do well at the time in as far as the vision goes, because everybody just took it at face value as an average Schwarzenegger movie, and then they just left it at that without really thinking about it. And then now it's kind of found that whole following where people do recognize exactly what it is and what they were going for. Whether they always hit the target or not remains to be seen, but it's still here. And talking about it coming from Stephen King's book, it is one of those cases where you think about, a Schwarzenegger movie based on a novel, and it's like, there's, especially an 80s Schwarzenegger movie based on a novel, and it's like, regardless of whatever that novel is it's kind of hard to imagine a Schwarzenegger movie being based on a novel and actually it's sticking to that source material. It's going to be a Schwarzenegger movie. Those liberties will be taken no matter what. But what's interesting about this is that some of the choices they made in regards to changing everything was the setup, and how it's actually somewhat more complex is a strong word to say about anything about The Running Man, but there's because the interesting thing about it is usually the book is the more complex version, and then it's a movie's job to just sort of simplify that. But it's almost so simple in the book that they kind of added some flair to it with what they do in the movie in regards to how he ends up playing the game. Because the book is really quite simple, and it's a whole entirely different setup. It's a whole entirely different thing, really. But starting off with him having a wife and a sick daughter, and he basically makes, as far as I remember, he makes the choice and basically volunteers to be part of the game for the money. So it's almost, I mean, you take out the sick daughter element out of it. The beginning of the, interestingly enough, talking about Schwarzenegger, the beginning of the book feels a lot more like the opening scenes of Total Recall than it does the actual adaptation of it. But and as far as that goes, um, it still has, the Schwarzenegger, aspects in it. The one-liners, like when he picks the guy up by his balls and says, "Can I give you a lift?" Or when he jams the pen in the guy's back after he signs all the forms, which is great. And of course he fits "I'll be back" into it, because of course he did. But you can see pretty much right away where they made a really big decision here in regards to the adaptation process, and and they actually worked really in their advantage, and you could see that they saw an opportunity, and they really just kind of took it, which was the fact that the game in the book is all over the country, and he's just running around just anywhere. But the idea to actually take the game show concept and make it an actual game show, I think kind of was them really seeing all the... They knew the satire they wanted to go for, and by shaping it like that, and because it would be like they're condensing it to that, because in the book you can just go anywhere, and that seems to open up a lot of possibilities. But in regards to doing the whole satire thing, there's so many new opportunities when you shape it in the actual form of a game show and treat it as such. So I thought that was a really interesting way to go, all the way down to seeing Killian handing out prizes in the audience while all the carnage is going on. And we get some commercials for stuff like that are a lot like I feel like the commercials in like RoboCop or something, where we see the Climbing for Dollars game, where it's a guy having to climb a rope, but there's like vicious dogs underneath him, and they're trying to bring him down in various ways. And that really shows off the stuff where it's like, it's sort of like the way the concept of Westworld works, where you have all these different areas you can go, and the story we're in can only really go in one direction, which is the Running Man, of course. But it does make you wonder, like, how many different stories you could tell just based on the different games, and where the protagonists of those games came from, and where they ended up, and all that. So it really opens up an interesting world to do it the way they did in the movie, which I really like. There are different games in the book also, but we really hardly get any focus on them outside of mentioning them. But of course, the thing that really brings this whole game show aspect to life is the brilliant casting of Killian, being Richard Dawson. Just the whole idea of casting an actual game show host. Because he had, all sorts of... He was on, like, Hogan's Heroes and stuff like that, and I think he had, like, a stand-up career at some point. But the fact that he was, like, one of, if not the quintessential game show host, and to be able to take that persona and bring it into this villainous character... Because the whole thing was, Dawson was like, audiences just ate up, like, every move he made. Even when he was being, weirdly touchy with all the contestants and stuff like that. The audiences just ate everything he did up. And to take that and put it into the role of this villain without him having to really change that persona outside of, like, the behind-the-scenes stuff that we get, which is just as good. And there's just... there's so much working in favor of that. And I also like that they kind of combine some characters here, because in the book it was... Killian is just, like, strictly the behind-the-scenes guy. And there's another character, Bobby Thompson, I think his name was, that acted as the MC, but they didn't really do much with that. They just said he was the MC and he introduced stuff. But to combine those two roles and bring out the Richard Dawson qualities that they could in this villainous character is really what brings the movie to life, honestly, despite all the other things going on. But like I said, the changes they did decide to make, like making the whole idea of how he ended up in the game, with starting with one prison break turns into like kind of a second escape and then a third escape, and then he ultimately gets there. It's like this whole chain of events. It's like the entire first third of the movie. But it all works, like I said, as far as adapting a novel into a Schwarzenegger movie in the 80s, because this was 87, so it was the same year as Predator. Which clearly the two are totally different tonally. Like, Predator is him, like, there's probably some stuff in Predator, for sure. that's a bit tongue-in-cheek, or, you know, they know what they're doing. But this one is, like, way beyond the whole, yeah, we know exactly what we're doing, and we know the audience knows what they're getting into, so we'll do this. Even if it turned out that the audience at the time, maybe not all of them did know exactly what they were in for, or what exactly it was doing, but it's still here regardless. And you've also got, speaking of Predator, you've got Jesse Ventura in here, as Captain Freedom. And just based on that name alone, before you even see his first scene, you get the vibe that he's also here to kind of clown on himself a little bit. To clown himself in good fun. Which really works also. And then you've got all the different characters coming in, like Sub-Zero and all these other people. And you see, like, the difference in regards to where we've seen where Schwarzenegger comes from and how he got here, and how Sub-Zero is this, like, ultimate adversary that almost succeeds in killing them. And when he's able to, our hero of the story is able to survive and defeat Sub-Zero, it's so jarring and interesting to watch the crowd mourn Sub-Zero. Like, they like, fall into complete silence and mourn him, because he's seen as, like, a hero to the audience, because he's the one killing the criminals inside of here. But the way those people are made to be villains, once we throw in an actual innocent person, then it goes into interesting directions. And there's also Fireball, the Jim Brown character, that is... I kind of wish they'd gotten a bit more of a showdown with him. He just kind of is introduced and then just kind of dispatched pretty much soon after. So once it gets to points like that, I can kind of start to see where people kind of started to only take it as, like, just a regular Schwarzenegger movie and kind of disregarding the satire, because it does eventually get a little redundant once the game is really, you know, going on, and the sort of villains just kind of come in and out, and you can get the idea, and it's kind of... I suppose I can get behind the idea of almost making it feel like almost like a video game in the way it works like that, but it does sort of... it kind of gets done in by its silliness by that point, and it is the case where there is some stuff in it that still definitely holds true, like the whole thing about, you know, reality TV and people's obsession with it and people's obsession with their own bloodlust and stuff like that. But also the whole thing where it's like, where the rich and the poor stand and just how far apart they are, and there's even the whole thing where the giant screens are outside and, like, the homeless people are basically have to look up like the people on TV are gods, practically. It's not a particularly subtle thing, but once we get to Gamer, we'll talk about the fact that subtlety just doesn't exist here, and we have to get over that. But even despite that, even despite the, you know, the gap between the rich and the poor, and people being bloodthirsty and obsessed with reality TV and stuff like that, there's also a lot of dated qualities in it too. There's enough of a balance that there's a lot of dated qualities in it too. The movie is so damn 80s. And sometimes you can, you know, love a movie for that, and other times it can just be like, well, this was certainly a product of that time, so so it kind of falls somewhere in there. I would like, actually, because they're so different, I would like to see, like, a more faithful adaptation of the book itself, pretty much just to see what it looks like, because there's also a lot of stuff that we've done with that, and it would just be pretty much a totally different movie. But to also touch on other things, like, it goes into the whole pollution thing and stuff like that. But as far as turning it into this and the whole idea of doing the satire of the game show and stuff like that, it's definitely, you know, entertaining enough while also making that point abundantly clear. And it's a movie that's really easy, you know, to come back to, and it's not my favorite Schwarzenegger movie by far, but it's one that I don't mind coming back to occasionally just to have fun with or whatever. So, yeah. But I do have a different opinion on Gamer, which, as we've seen, takes a similar concept, but as we've seen, not a new concept whatsoever. I mean, apart from, because with, you know, The Running Man, you had stuff like The Most Dangerous Game you could compare it to and stuff like that. But now, by the time Gamer has come out, there's so many other things that you can compare it to. So the concept can feel old, and the statement it's making is surely not new. But the thing that really as far as Gamer goes, because we were talking about what it is that brings the Running Man to life. And even then, it wasn't necessarily the concept, despite the fact that the concept is the selling point. But in this case, with Gamer, it is because we talked about with the Running Man how Schwarzenegger was displeased with the director and how it turned out, and how he thought it was basically shot like a TV show, which he didn't think kind of undermined what it was they were going for, despite how appropriate that sounds. As far as like aesthetically, I get what he means. But the direction of Gamer is where it really comes to life. Because it was done by Neldine and Taylor, who are best known for Crank. But they have a particular style that is so insane and so extreme and so their own thing that it has been copied so much since they started. And you could say it wasn't a new style before them or before they did Crank or whatever. But they definitely did it in their own way, to where every time a movie tries the frenetic style of these movies, or the extreme nature of these movies, it always feels like they're just copying Neldine and Taylor at this point. And they are two guys where I can love one of their movies, or I can hate one of their movies. I think Crank 2, personally, and I'm sure I've stressed this many times before already, I think Crank 2 is one of the worst movies I've ever seen. I hate Crank 2 to its very core. But I also really, really appreciate what they did with it, to the point that when I talk about how much I hate Crank 2, I can talk for days about how much I hate Crank 2. But the fact that they went so goddamn balls to the wall as much as they possibly could when they made that movie, there's something special there, regardless of how I feel about the quality of the movie. There's something that I appreciate about the fact that a movie exists that I can hate that much, that went that far over the top. And it's like, I almost thank them for the experience that made me miserable. And I don't know how else I can explain that, but, and that's the way I feel about most of their movies, because I really loved Crank when it first came out. And it was like, I felt like I had never seen anything like that. Where it was just non-stop, and everything, like every frame of it, felt so insane. And then they made this. This came out the same year as Crank 2. I think Crank 2 came out in like April, and then this came out in like later in like the fall, like early September. Gamer came out. And I just... I've said this many times before. Like I said, I've referenced it many times before, but I'll just flat out say this before I actually talk about it. I really, really love Gamer. I love just about everything about it, despite the fact that, like I was saying, how there's so many people that try to copy that Neldine and Taylor, aesthetic now. It's... like, what I love about this movie is what I hate about the movies that tried to copy it. Like, everything that I say is a good thing about this movie, I would probably say is a reason I hate. Like, it's a shitty thing about the other movies like it, or trying to be like it, and failing miserably. And it's a movie where pretty much just as soon as it starts, no matter how many times I see it, I feel the need to, like, hang on to something. Because the whole thing is such a rush, pretty much from beginning to end, and it's insane and it's crazy. So we're in like 2034 or something, and the different take it's kind of doing now is, instead of just doing the whole Running Man scenario or the Most Dangerous Game scenario or whatever, now the prisoners are being controlled by players, and they're basically a living video game, complete with NPCs that just sort of walk around like weird zombies. It's actually kind of creepy when they bring that aspect into it. And everything about this movie, from this first gaming scene forward, is just complete and total excess in the way that Neldine and Taylor know how to do it. And it's got, like I said, all those things that make other movies shitty, like the way it's shot, like the shaky cam and the whole frenetic nature of it. But it's just, the whole extreme nature of it is so fitting to this movie and the action that's going on in it. that I feel like it fits. It's one of those rare cases where that kind of style can actually fit perfectly. Like, usually it's the kind of thing where I say it's something straight-to-video action directors do, and it fucking sucks. But there's, like I said, there's something about the world that this movie creates to where you feel like that's the only way to show off this world, is in that kind of style. And it just works somehow. And it's like, even when I watch it again, knowing how much I love the movie, I'll see certain aspects like that and think, why don't I hate this? And, like, not only do I not hate it, but I love it. In this movie in particular. Yet no other movie seems to be able to pull it off that tries. Because you even got stuff like Hardcore Henry, which straight up took a scene from this movie, like straight up stole a particular scene in this movie, but also just kind of in general seemed to be taking from Nobody Knows or left and right, and it just felt pathetic. But when you watch this, like I said, the world they establish is so almost sort of otherworldly, because not just because it's set in a future, but like when you see the place, when we see all the prisoners together, where they're just in that place, it's just like dirt and sand or whatever, when he's talking to John Leguizamo that first time, it looks like they're on another planet, almost. And there's just something so sort of, I don't know, the way it sort of separates them from the world, even though we don't get that much of a look at the world, because it's like the whole setup tells us, people are enthralled in two different things. Either it's society or it's Slayers, the two things that Ken Castle has created here that are just this whole practically virtual reality thing where people get sort of like the Ready Player One scenario, where you can see like the whole world has gone to shit and just looks like this mass dump, but nobody notices because they're too entranced in their entertainment. Just being these two particular things. And that's the thing too, is when we see Society, the one where you're in like this supposed perfect world and you can do whatever you want with whoever you want, it's like, and once again, nobody ever said Gamer was subtle. Nobody is ever going to say that. And with that in mind, yes, I do love the fact that Society almost has as much of an insanity to it as Slayers does, despite the fact that Slayers is literally about people being able to control people and kill real people, and Society's supposed to be like this paradise sort of place. But there is an equal amount of insanity to them when we go inside them and see what the real depths are, and I think it's the whole idea that Society is under such a guise is what gives it that whole, even more of an eerie sort of feel, even if all of the blood and carnage and bodies aren't completely displayed, like on the surface. The fact that it's underlying what's happening here, but it's so perfect on the surface, is what's so damn creepy about it. And it just works perfectly. And then you go to Slayers, and you have the gaming scenes where, like, everything's really gruesome and intense and thrilling and psychotic, really. Just the whole thing about it. Like, it feels like you're in the mind of an insane person when we're inside Slayers, which is exactly what that should feel like. Especially since technically we are watching somebody in the mind of psychotic people, with the exception of Logan Lerman being the star gamer because he's inside Gerard Butler, but the fact that Gerard Butler is not actually who he seems to be. But the way that ties into the plot with Ken Castle getting him here and all that stuff is its own thing that works really well also. But especially as far as the action scenes go, the escape scene. The escape scene is so good. Oh my god. And then the way it incorporates Marilyn Manson's Sweet Dreams, which might seem pretty on the nose. Because it's the opening song and it's the song during the escape scene, but it just, like... Because you see how that's where that song came from in regards to movies, where, like, I think it first surfaced for the House on Haunted Hill remake with Jeffrey Rush. And then it made a reappearance in the werewolf scene in Trick or Treat. And the fact that it's put in such identifiable places in those two movies, you would think that that song is done now, and anytime it's used in another movie, it's just like, oh, that song again, okay. But it's practically the anthem of this movie when it plays during this scene as well as the opening scene, and it's the most fitting the song has ever been. I mean, I love the scene in Trick or Treat as well, but it just feels like it's so suited for this movie. Like, if I had not heard Marilyn Manson's cover of that song before this, I would think it was done specifically for this movie. The way I think it may have been for House on Haunted Hill, but I'm not positive. So, yeah. But that's where I remember hearing it at first. So then we have some of our other cast members here. I mentioned Ken Castle by name a few times, and let's just talk about how glorious this Michael C. Hall performance is. Still in mid-Dexter when this came out, and he's so perfectly cast, especially, and you get such a glimpse of it in this interview scene with Kara Sedgwick to start. It starts the whole movie off, is this interview with Ken Castle. And the thing is the way Hall plays it, he's so perfectly combines this whole billionaire douchebag scenario with this, like, the mindset of a complete psycho that would come up with this stuff, and is basically the orchestrator of all the carnage that we see. And it's like being able to combine those so perfectly works so well, because he just comes off so smug and arrogant in this gloriously villainous way in this opening interview scene. And the great thing about that also is he's so good and leaves such an impression. It's one of those performances where you forget just how little he's in it because he makes such an impression. Because I feel like he's in it a lot, I feel like. But when I go back and watch it, it's like, it's the opening interview scene. Then there's a brief scene where he's, like, eating while watching the news. Then there's the scene where he introduces Terry Crews. And then I think we don't see him again until the climax. So it's basically like 4 scenes, roughly. And the impact that he makes to where it feels like he's in the whole movie really says something about what he brings to the table, I think. So that's great. And like I said, you got Kara Sedgwick in here basically being that embodiment of the media that we see. Where, like, pretty much all the media satire is on her shoulders, and she does that pretty much perfectly. And I mentioned Terry Crews, who's kind of legitimately scary in this, especially that locker room scene where he's, like, really creepy. And it's like, you know, Michael C. Hall sets him up by saying, you know, nobody controls him, he does his own thing, and that's what makes him so scary. And then he gets to have that locker room scene where he starts singing I've Got No Strings to Cable. And it's like, yeah, he did that 6 years before Ultron did, just so we're clear. And so, going on that, we also have John Leguizamo, I mentioned before, playing a character named Freak, which may very well be a self-reference to his incredible one-man show of the same name. So that's great. He's here a little too briefly, like he often is. When you guys have John Leguizamo, you need to keep him around a little longer. All the movies have that problem for some reason. We got Zoe Bell in here, who shows up just long enough for her head to explode, which is okay. If she's going to go out, she might as well go out in a gloriously gruesome fashion. We have Keith David here playing a character named Agent Keith, of course. Sort of like the same thing as John Leguizamo. It's like, I feel like it's intentional casting or intentional naming here. And his scene with Logan Lerman's really great, where he's really interrogating him, but then kind of gets distracted by his interest is piqued by the idea of pistachio butter. And then you've got Milo Ventimiglia here, playing a character named Rick Rape. And I just called him Rick Rape for so long, that, once again, kind of like in Michael C. Hall's case, that stuck in my memory so much. This character, who is barely here, stuck in my memory so much, I forgot that he's in the movie for like 30 seconds. He's in the movie for like 30 seconds before Cable literally breaks his body over his knee and we never see him again because he's fucking dead. And it's like the impact that these characters make with such small screen time is something that I think also it kind of really makes it exceed the characters that come and go on The Running Man. Where it's like, they come out and their gimmicks are known and stuff like that. But it's like, by the time they come out is when the movie starts feeling redundant with The Running Man. And with Gamer, I feel like the movie comes to life in a new way every time we see a new character. Even if they're there for, like I said, barely a fraction of a second. It's even the guy controlling Cable's wife. The really massively, morbidly obese guy that has an oxygen tank and eats waffles by the stack with a bowl of syrup next to him. Just weird, disgusting details like that are what make this movie amazing. And it's like, the more it goes into the depravity of everything, it just makes the world come to life even more and shows just how we got to the point to where people only want to be enslayers or society. And it's Right, and you've even got these little offbeat characters here and there, like the news anchors who just say whatever the hell they want, whether they're on the air or not. Or you've got the person interviewing Cable's wife, and he's going through her whole thing, and he talks about she has a husband that's on death row for first-degree murder. And when he says first-degree murder, he giggles like a little girl, and it's really creepy and weird, and he never acts like that again in the scene, but it's just such this weird enough touch that it just sticks in your mind and makes all the just the disgusting nature of everybody in this world. That's with the exception of like one or two characters. And it's, like I said, I love the movie for that. I don't care. And then eventually we get to the point where we come to our climax, where, like I said, we've got the I've got you under my skin scene. Which, like I said, we've got, you know, Ultron doing the whole creepy I've got no strings thing that Terry Crews did 6 years prior. Now we got the whole thing where Hardcore Henry just straight up snatched a scene from this movie and used it for its own whatever the fuck. And it's a great scene in this movie. It is so over the top and ridiculous in the way that this movie has no choice but to climax as. Like, it's inevitable that the movie came to this point. And I love it for that. And I love the idea as well that I talk about, we don't see Ken Castle again, like, you know, like in full until we get to this climax. And the fact that I talk about that he's basically the billionaire douchebag, but he's also got psychopathic qualities, is in cases like this, like you'll see in cases like The Running Man, for instance, where we have sort of the brains behind the operation that wears the suits and stuff like that, with Killian, and then we've got the brains and then we've got the brawn, and the brawn is all the people that are actually in the game, that are the muscle and stuff like that. And it's the kind of thing you see in a lot of movies, where there's a brains and a brawn in regards to where the villains end up. And even though Killian gets a gloriously explosive death in The Running Man, usually it's the case of the suit, the brains, kind of gets an unceremonious death as kind of a final punctuation mark to the movie right before it ends. But the main final fight is typically the brawn, where they have a real physical fight on their hands. So you would think the brains and the brawn are Michael C. Hall and Terry Crews. And when he finally fights Terry Crews hand to hand for this climax, it doesn't last very long, and that double neck snap is amazing, by the way. It's a great way for a villain like Terry Crews' character in here to go out. So based on that trope, regardless of how brief it is or whatever, how it's staged, whatever, I love that Cable and Ken Castle get a physical fight. Because it's kind of so unexpected. Because Castle has been seen as just, you know, the brains of the operation, and he, you know, wears his whatever clothes he's wearing in his, you know, rich, you know, mansion or whatever it is, watching his giant TVs and just orchestrating from afar. But to see him, like, rip his shirt off like he's fucking Bruce Lee and start to actually fight Cable is amazing. I love that actually happens, that they have an actual physical fight. And then, of course, beating him with his own weapon, of course, which is a whole running thing in The Running Man. So, and then that's it. That's basically it. He just takes his daughter and his wife, and he just goes off, and the movie just stops itself. There's no need for any sort of, like, epilogue or anything like that. It just does what it does, and then it's over, and that's it. And like I said, I think there are things that I like about The Running Man, especially with the way they took the book and decided they could make a sort of traditional 80s action movie out of it, while also kind of doing the satire of the media thing. But there are cases where it does kind of start to become more of the same, and it kind of starts to lose itself a little bit, and you can acknowledge that it does just kind of feel like a product of that, and you could see where it's dated. Gamer is 11 years old now, which obviously isn't near as old as The Running Man is, but still. And there's probably people that think, you know, there's probably dated concepts and stuff like that in Gamer, but this movie still just works for me as this absolute full-on adrenaline rush of everything I just said, and is the embodiment of what Neldon and Taylor do. There's also, they did Ghost Rider 2, the Spirit of Vengeance, and there's a video me and my brother did where we talk about that, And once again, even though I'm not the biggest fan of that movie, just how insanely pumped they get me to talk about a movie they have made is enough. Like, the movie doesn't even have to be great, but just the way they go for the absolute extreme just gets me so hyped to talk about a movie, whether I hate it or not, like I talked about with Crank 2, or a movie I'm indifferent to, like Ghost Rider 2. But I genuinely love Gamer. Like, and as far as Butler goes, he's got, you know, I like Law Abiding Citizen a lot. I like 300 a lot. I like his Olympus Has Fallen trilogy pretty well as well, but I think I can honestly say, you know, critical acclaim on some of these be damned. I think Gamer is my favorite Gerard Butler movie. It's my favorite movie that nobody in Taylor did. I know Crank is Crank, but I just really love Gamer, and the fact that it can still. I was kind of thinking like, well, maybe I'll watch it again, and it won't be, you know, as great, especially since there's these qualities now. That, like when I talk about Rob Zombie's movies and how he kind of started taking on the same sort of things through his movies that I used to like and stuff like The Devil's Rejects and House of 1,000 Corpses, but then it got really stale. And then when I went back and watched stuff like The Devil's Rejects, it starts to feel stale because he made it stale with his previous movies. And while this style has gotten so stale because so many people try to steal from Nobody and Taylor, and I'm not, and I know there's so many idiots out there that watch YouTube videos that I have to clarify, I'm not saying that Gamer invented anything. I'm not saying that at all. But Nobody and Taylor have such a specific style that feels so stolen as of late, especially by these straight-to-DVD tier action directors. I was afraid that would taint it, but I went back and watched it recently, and it doesn't. I still love this movie as much as I did, and it's still just as much of an adrenaline rush as it's always been. So that's how I feel. And like I said, every time we talk about movies like frenetic action, I seem to fall back on Gamer when I'm saying, like, you know, they're trying to be that style, or they're kind of trying to do that sort of thing. Even though there's so many movies that predate Gamer that you could say they're trying to do that too, but a Gamer just is so ingrained in my mind now because it just makes that much of an impression. I really just love it that much. So, I think it's pretty clear which of these I prefer, and which one I think did their overall concept better. I do think there's much more, as far as the satire goes, I think The Running Man kind of went into that a lot more. And like I said, it's just pretty much there in general in Gamer with Kira Sedgwick's character, but the way they played with the game show and they actually cast Richard Dawson, and the way you see him interacting with the crowd and all that, passing out The Running Man, the home game, and stuff like that. All of that works in The Running Man's favor, probably more so, but as far as just a movie in general, and the action, and the characters, and all that stuff, I don't think Gamer can be beat in this scenario, as far as these two go, so that's how I feel about that. So the next thing is going to be another Stephen King video, I think, and then my brother and I are doing another Versus, so those will be the next thing, and then whatever Owen and Ashley have planned will probably be after that. So, and then we'll continue the King thing, and my brother and I will continue the Versus thing, and so on. And I'll do a couple of these standalone ones as well. So until all of whatever's next, that's it.